Have you ever stopped to wonder what really makes you, you? Well, today we're going to dive into the fascinating science of stress and uncover something pretty wild: how your unique personality can actually change the way your brain and body respond to pressure.
I mean, it's a question we've all thought about, right? You see it everywhere, at work, in school, even within your own family. You give two people the exact same challenge, and one person just shines, while the other feels completely overwhelmed. So what's the deal? Well, it turns out the answer is deeply personal and deeply biological. The easiest way to wrap your head around stress is to think of it like your body's built-in alarm system. It's this brilliant, ancient piece of programming designed to keep you safe from danger. It gets you ready for intense, immediate action. But what happens when that alarm system starts to go haywire? See, stress really has two completely different phases. On one hand, you've got acute stress. That's the good kind. It's your alarm going off during an actual fire. Your body gets flooded with hormones like cortisol and adrenaline to help you either fight the danger or get away from it. It's an amazing survival tool. But then there's chronic stress, and that's like the same alarm getting stuck in the on position, just blaring 24/7 even when there's no fire in sight. And that constant state of high alert, that's what causes some serious long-term damage.
Okay, so here's the more scientific definition from our source material. The two words to really focus on here are long-term. A stressor, and that could be anything from a tough job to a bad relationship or even just a negative memory you can't shake, can trigger this same physical response day in and day out.
The guy known as the father of stress research, Hans Selye, actually mapped this whole thing out. He called it the general adaptation syndrome, and it happens in 3 stages. First up, you've got the alarm. That's that initial jolt, the classic fight or flight response. Then, if the stressor sticks around, you enter the resistance stage. Here, your body is trying its best to adapt, but it stays on high alert. The problem is, you can't stay there forever, and eventually you hit stage 3, exhaustion, and that's where your body's resources are just tapped out, leading to burnout and all kinds of health problems. And that exhaustion stage, man, it causes some real measurable damage. When your brain is constantly swimming in stress hormones, it can literally stop the growth of new brain cells. It can mess with your memory, and it can even rewire your emotional responses, making you feel more fear and aggression. It's basically a system-wide breakdown. So, with all that in mind about chronic stress, let's zoom in on a really specific and complex case where the science is absolutely crucial: borderline personality disorder, or BPD. For decades, the scientific community has been kind of locked in this debate about where it really comes from. And this controversy isn't just some academic squabble. It has huge real-world consequences for how people are seen and how they're treated. For a long time, there was this big overlap in symptoms with other conditions like PTSD. And honestly, a whole lot of stigma got attached to the BPD diagnosis itself. And this is where it gets really stark. The way the two conditions were often viewed couldn't be more different. A person with PTSD was usually seen as a victim of some awful external event. But the BPD diagnosis, it often carried this heavy implication of having intractable personality problems, which, in a way, put the blame on the person themselves instead of on what they'd been through. So this became the million-dollar question for researchers. Was BPD the result of severe trauma, or was it something rooted deep inside a person's inherited personality, or something else entirely? To get to the bottom of it, scientists had to start untangling this incredibly complex web of different factors. They basically became detectives, following the scientific clues that connect a person's life experiences with their fundamental biology. The first major clue they found was, well, it was massive. Over 80% of people diagnosed with BPD report experiencing significant childhood trauma, like abuse or neglect. This was a powerful, undeniable link, and it made trauma a prime suspect in the investigation. But here's the thing, it couldn't be the only factor. I mean, think about it. Lots of people experience trauma and don't develop BPD, so there had to be another piece to the puzzle, right? And researchers found it in our inherited personality traits. And this right here, this is the absolute game changer. It turns out our baseline personality seems to set the dials on our biological stress response. For instance, studies show that people who are higher in a trait called neuroticism, which is a tendency to feel negative emotions, have a much stronger cortisol reaction when they're stressed out. But people higher in extroversion, they often have a more toned-down response. So our personality isn't just in our heads, it's literally written in our hormones. Okay, so let's put our two main clues together on the table. You've got the external factor, childhood trauma, And you have the internal, inherited factor, our core personality traits. So, how do these two things actually interact? Well, the research points to them combining to create a core problem with something called affect regulation. Now, that's just a fancy way of saying the ability to manage your emotions, to ride the emotional waves without getting totally swept away by them. And that intense difficulty in managing emotions, which is driven by that combination of early trauma and a biologically sensitive personality, is what ultimately leads to the symptoms that we recognize as BPD. So you see, it's not one or the other, it's the powerful interaction of both.
And this whole new understanding is creating a completely new path forward for mental health research, one that finally moves us beyond those simplistic either-or explanations.
At the end of the day, this is the big takeaway. The whole debate was never supposed to be about nature versus nurture. What the science is screaming at us is that it's always been about how our nature, our innate biology, interacts with our nurture, our life experiences. This new perspective has led scientists to focus on what they call transdiagnostic factors. Now, that might sound a little complicated, but the idea is actually pretty simple. Instead of just focusing on the label of one specific disorder, they're looking at the underlying processes, like that affect regulation we talked about, that are shared across many different conditions that stem from trauma. And this is why this shift is so important. By studying these core mechanisms, we can get insights that help us understand and treat a whole spectrum of trauma-related challenges. We can finally move beyond the stigma of any single diagnosis and look at the whole person.
You know, there's a quote from the primary research paper that just sums this up perfectly. The goal, they say, is to disentangle the complex pathways between trauma, personality, and the development of all forms of related struggles. It's all about seeing the bigger picture.
Which leaves us with a final and, I think, really powerful question for ourselves. If we know that our own innate personality traits actually shape how we physically and mentally experience stress, what can we learn about our own unique wiring? What can we do to better manage our internal alarm systems and build a more resilient life in what is, let's face it, a pretty stressful world?